Thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you, Augustine, for that introduction. I want to share really quickly with all of you our agenda for the day. You can see for this next more or less hour what we want to talk about, which is really our experience the fall of 2019 in Chile and the lessons that we learned from that. So it's a pretty simple agenda. Hopefully we answer a lot of your questions about what we experienced through our presentation, but if not, there will be time for Q&A at the end as well. And as a starting place, I just want to mention who we are as the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. We are two small private liberal arts colleges located in small towns in central Minnesota. We are a college for women, the College of St. Benedict, and a college for men, St. John's University. And combined, we have about 3,200 students. Study abroad is a very important part of our identity at St. Ben's and St. John's. We are a nationally recognized leader by IIE Open Doors for our participation overall in study abroad, but specifically for our students' participation in semester-length study abroad programming. We send about 500 students abroad every year, about 300 of those on semester programs. And what this means is that more than half of our students will study abroad by the time that they graduate. The signature model for study abroad at St. Ben's and St. John's is our semester programs. We operate 17 semester programs on 6 continents every year. 11 of those programs are faculty-led, like our program in Chile that Michael was the faculty director for last fall. A faculty-led program for us means that a St. Ben's and St. John's or St. John's faculty member accompanies the students abroad. They provide support to the students for the duration of their experience. They teach one course, and the rest of the academic program is always delivered by our partners on site. And one of those partners for us is UAE. We have actually this fall would have been 16 years of sending students to Adolfo Ibáñez. However, COVID changed that for everyone. But last fall was our 15th year sending students to Adolfo Ibáñez. We've sent almost 350 students to UAE for study abroad experiences and 12 faculty directors, some directors having returned more than once. Additionally, for 9 years, St. Ben's and St. John's hosted UAE students on our campus for short-term study abroad experiences. And we also welcome students from UAE as exchange students. So we have a very reciprocal, long-standing relationship. And I wanted to give you all that context as we go into talking about what happened during the fall of 2019 and what we learned from it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael to talk about our experience.
Thank you, Nicole. The students and I arrived in Chile in late July of 2019, and we started the semester shortly thereafter. In October 14th, specifically a Monday, there was a protest in the metro system of Santiago, started by young children, and not really young, they were adolescents, mostly high school students. And this protest started to spread during the week of October 14th. It was in the newspaper. It didn't seem to affect those of us in Villa del Mar very much, but it was a prominent news story, and it gathered a lot of attention. On Friday, October 18th, the police moved in to expel the protesters, and the protesters started engaging in a nonviolent protest where they would dangle their feet over the edge of the subway platforms. And this provoked a strong response from the police, and it led to a large-scale protest in Santiago. The night of Friday the 18th, I was at a wine tasting in Viña with some colleagues, with my wife and some colleagues from UAE, and we started hearing pots and pans bang. And when this started, my Chilean colleagues and number of other people at the wine tasting pulled out their cell phones and started consulting their cell phones. And it turns out that the protests in Santiago had started to spread to the entire country. And this was the start of a massive social protest. In Chile, it was called a social explosion that brought everything in the country to a halt. That weekend, the protests spread. By Monday, they had gripped the entire country. Businesses were shutting down, schools and universities were shutting down, and a curfew was imposed. Some of the protests were violent. Some of the violence came from the police. Some came from a very, very small number of protesters. The vast majority of protesters, 99% at least, were very peaceful and very organized. They were expressing their legitimate political concerns. But the interesting thing for us at the university is that it totally disrupted classes. So classes were canceled for a week, school was closed for a week, and we eventually partially reopened, but then later on we had to go virtual, go completely remote during that time. So that this was a very, very dramatic social crisis. It was a very disruptive event for the semester. It is in some ways similar to events that take place in many other parts of the world. No region of the world is immune to these kinds of social explosions. In Minneapolis just this year, there was a similar event when an African-American, George Floyd, was killed by the police. And Minneapolis, Minnesota, which is not, which is far, far to the north of Chile, experienced much of the same, many of the same things that we observed in Chile during the social explosion. So these events can happen all over the world. And in some ways, the social crisis in Chile was a kind of dress rehearsal for the COVID-19 pandemic, which is also a very dramatic, disruptive force. So that's a little background about the social crisis. I had 18 students, and only one of them went home during the crisis. The others stayed to the very end of the semester and completed the semester. And I want to just turn it over to Nicole for a minute, because we have very interesting data about the students' experience. And then I'll talk more about my experience and what I learned on the ground working with UAE. Nicole?
So we thought it would be interesting to share some of the data about the students' experience. And our office collects evaluation data from all of our students who study abroad on semester programs. These questions were not asked specifically about the social crisis, but they were asked specifically about the students' experience in Chile. And one of the things that was really interesting to me as I looked at the data is that overall, the students had a very positive experience in their time in Chile, even in light of this experience, or maybe because of this experience. But you can see on the screen that all of the students say that if they had to do it over again, they would pick the Chile Study Abroad program. And almost all of them would recommend it to other students. It was also very clearly a good learning experience for our students, where all of them indicated that they gained significant insight into another culture, and that this experience really influenced their worldview and impacted their interest to learn more about Chile and the Chilean culture. Additionally, we ask some questions every year about safety, and I thought it was very interesting to see that almost all of the students, 91%, said that they felt safe in Viña del Mar, and also that they felt safe at UAE. And what's really interesting about these numbers is that they're almost parallel to the 2018 numbers. So even in light of the social explosion that Michael talked about, students still felt very safe during their time in Chile. And now I'm going back to Michael for him to share some of the lessons learned on the ground directing a program.
Thank you, Nicole. I want to begin by talking about two takeaways for me that are very, very important. One is that leading a study abroad program during a time of uncertainty is very, very doable. That this is not something that is impossible. In fact, it's quite reasonable and practical to be able to carry out. The second general point I want to make is that because of the social unrest, I felt my students got a great deal more out of the program in terms of insights into history and culture and politics and economics than my previous students have either in Chile or Spain. They were witnessing a historical event and it had a powerful impact on them. And I think that is a very important lesson, a very important takeaway, that these experiences generally are very valuable. They are extremely valuable if, in fact, the students are able to observe history unfolding. So those are the two takeaways that I hope all the people in the seminar, in this conference, remember. But there are three particular lessons that I learned along with my colleagues at UIE in the Office of International Relationships. And that is that communication is important, transparency is important, and having safety protocols in place are very, very important. So let me just elaborate a little bit on all of these. As the situation unfolded, UIE was very, very aggressive in communicating constantly with the students and with me. We used email, we used social media, but mostly we used WhatsApp, which all of my students had on their phones, which I learned to do, which was impressive given my age. And the communication was constant, and it was frequent, and it was in multiple forms. And this is very important because the students needed to know what was happening almost on an hour-by-hour basis. My job was to communicate with UIE, the students, and my home university. And I spent a great deal of time talking with those and communicating with those three groups. In addition to using WhatsApp, I had daily check-ins with my students, once a day with WhatsApp and once a day with the Zoom meeting. So we would have classes on Zoom as a substitute for our regular class. And we would also have, in addition to that, we would have a discussion meeting on Zoom where people could talk about what was happening, we could process the news, we could talk about what they were feeling, what they were observing, and what they thought. And these reflection sessions were very, very important. In addition to the reflection sessions that I did with my students, UIE also did reflection sessions and debriefing sessions with their broader university student body and with the international students. And so I think all of these forms of communication, using email, social media, WhatsApp, are very, very important. And having frequent informative communications and also debriefing sessions with the students is very, very important. The second lesson I learned is that transparency is especially important. You need to tell people if you don't know something. As soon as you find out information, you need to share it. You need to talk about and tell people how the decisions are being made and when they're going to be made, so that people have a sense of control and a sense of understanding about what's happening. And I thought my colleagues at UAI, especially Carlos Ramirez and Agustin Julio, were exceptional, and all of their team were exceptional at being very, very transparent. If they didn't know something, they would say so. If they were in the process of deciding, they would say so. As soon as they made a decision, they would share it. Transparency, I think, is almost as important as communication. And transparency between me and my students and between me and my host university was also really crucial. The final lesson that I learned is the importance of having safety protocols in place. We always emphasize safety with our students. Most of the safety protocols that we emphasize in Chile have to do with what to do in case of an earthquake, what to do if you're pickpocketed, and how to maintain your personal safety. In Viña del Mar, which is a large city, many of our students come from small towns or suburbs, and so they're not used to living in a large city. So we emphasize earthquake safety protocols, pickpocketing safety protocols, and personal safety protocols. Those were really, really important when all of this started. And as the curfew was imposed and as there were some riots and police violence that were taking place, these safety protocols were especially important. So I think having safety protocols is really essential in any kind of study abroad program, but especially in times of social upheaval or in times, for example, of a pandemic such as COVID-19. So ultimately, you cannot keep the students safe. Only the students can keep themselves safe. And this is a point that we emphasize, that it's your responsibility to follow these safety protocols. These safety protocols will help keep you safe. And that's an important part of having a successful program. So those were the lessons that I learned on the ground. The importance of communication, the importance of transparency, and the importance of having safety protocols in place. And I want to turn it back over to Nicole now, and she can talk about the lessons she's learned.
Thanks, Michael. So I want to say, first of all, that a lot of the lessons that Michael learned on the ground really are lessons that we learned back in our office as well. The lessons about the importance of communication and transparency. These are things that those of us who work and study abroad know are important, but in the middle of a crisis, it becomes even more evident why they are important. And in regards to safety protocols, I really want to thank both UAI and our program directors for the work they do before a crisis, preparing students for these things. On our campuses, we have an intensive orientation program that happens prior to students' departure. We have a day-long orientation for all of our study abroad students that are going to the 17 different programs. But we also have our directors do 2 to 3 individual sessions where they can talk specifically about the context of the country where students will be studying. So through these sessions, we are really able to have students prepare for this ahead of time so that it's not something that they need to learn in the moment. In terms of the lessons specifically that we learned as a host university, or things that were reinforced for us in the Center for Global Education, the first key takeaway is that in a crisis, it's really important to have good partners, and it's important to know them. Because of our longstanding relationship with UAI, I knew the people in the office, I knew the people in the International Relations Office who were managing the crisis. And I knew that they had the best interest of our students, the safety of our students, as their #1 priority. I also knew that they had a high level of professionalism and expertise, and I trusted them. And I promise they didn't pay me to say that, but these things are invaluable in a crisis, to have that relationship and to trust your partners on the ground. And even without a 15-year history, you can still build these relationships. You can go to conferences and get to know these teams at a NAFSA conference or at EAIA. It's certainly possible today through Zoom to have conversations with your partners on the ground. And if at all possible, to do site visits, to be able to see these places and meet these people and know more about the space in which your students will be having an experience. So really, it's key to build these relationships and to have that trust before a crisis comes. And one other point I want to make about good partners is that study abroad comes in a lot of different formats from different universities and study abroad providers. And as you know, it also comes with a lot of different price tags. And it's not always about finding the cheapest partner. And in fact, in a crisis, I think what we learn is that the most important thing is to have a partner who you trust, who you know is going to take care of your students. And for us, UAE is one of those partners. Another thing that I learned is that it's really important to have a clear division of labor. Crises are chaotic in their nature, so it's really important in the beginning to be clear about who is going to be responsible for what. And for us, we had kind of three general buckets in terms of responsibility. There was what UAE was going to be doing, there was what our program director on the ground, the local representative of our university, was going to be doing, and then there was what we were going to be doing back in our office in Minnesota. And I know that for some of you listening to this presentation, you won't be in the situation that we were in. You may not have a local representative of your university on the ground. And in that case, I do know that the International Relations Office really stepped in and filled that role for students who are not abroad with the faculty director. But we, with our model of study abroad, we're very fortunate to have Michael on the ground with our students as well, as one of our kind of legs of support. And so, as Michael mentioned, UAE was doing the high-level coordination. They were communicating really broadly safety protocols, and they were focusing on the academics and academic continuity. Many of the courses had to be moved to an online format, and the syllabi had to be shifted. And that wasn't something that in Minnesota I needed to figure out. That was something that UAE was responsible for, and they were taking care of. And then Michael, as our the representative of St. Ben's and St. John's, our program director on the ground, his primary focus was our students. And we really wanted to be sure that we protected that space for him, that he could be focused on the safety of our students as his #1 priority. And then second to that, helping the students make sense of what was happening and putting it into a larger context. As he mentioned, he was in frequent communication with UAE, with our office, and with the students. But the kind of goal of that all the time was focusing on the safety of our students. And so we were very fortunate to have that in our situation. And then back in Minnesota, in our office, we were really focused on kind of quarterbacking communication for our partners back in the United States. And so for us, the stakeholders that we needed to communicate with were primarily university administrators and also parents. And I want to mention that because for our student population, communication with parents was actually really helpful in a crisis. And we made a decision early on that we were going to communicate with students and parents at the same time. We were going to send them the same messaging so that everyone was on the same page. And our hope in this is that it interrupted parents going to UAE or parents going to Michael directly to ask for more information or ask for more context so that the other people could focus on the things that they were supposed to focus on and we could focus on what was happening back in the United States. So having a clear division of labor, knowing who is responsible for what, is really helpful in these times of crisis. And then the last thing I want to mention that Michael mentioned and touched on as well is that it's really important to create a space for reflection. And within international education, this is nothing new. We know that reflection is important, but I think that it becomes even more heightened during times of a crisis. And I have to acknowledge that for some of our students, there were moments of this crisis that were legitimately scary and maybe even felt traumatic. And so we needed to be sure to create a space for students to talk about that and for students to be able to make sense of what was happening. In talking to the students after they returned from Chile, one of the things that became very clear was that they had that space, both provided by UAE and by our program director, and they were very thankful for that. There were formal opportunities that were arranged by UAE, and there were also informal opportunities. As Michael mentioned, you know, he checked in with the students daily. They had Zoom every day when classes weren't in session. And I also know that he took students out for pizza lunches just to talk to them about how they were doing and what was going on. And those touch points were really helpful for our students, and I imagine for all students who are experiencing this probably for the first time. And once our students got back to campus, our office also invited them all to a coffee hour to be able to talk about what they learned during the crisis specifically, or what they learned related to the crisis. And it was really a good session. The Center for Global Education director and myself hosted it, and the students who we had, first of all, it was really insightful for us to hear what they had experienced and to hear what they had learned. But in that session, it was also clear that even months later, they were still processing and they were still making sense about what they had experienced in Chile. And so I think that providing those spaces for reflection, both during the crisis, immediately following the crisis, and then further down the road, it's also really helpful. And it's helpful not only to have that reflection for the students, but also for us as people who administer study abroad programs. We learned a lot too during this time. You know, our team had debrief sessions with the staff in UAE, with our program director. We talked about what worked and what didn't work so well. And honestly, as part of our debrief with the students, that was one of the questions we asked them too, was what would have been helpful? What do you wish you would have seen from the university back home? And so I think it's really important during these crises to have space for reflection for the students, but also for us as study abroad administrators. And we did learn things from that. You know, as one example from all of the crises that happened last year, we're now requiring cell phones for all of our students who go abroad. And I know this is something other universities have done earlier, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that we learned things and we're making changes moving forward because of what happened in Chile. And I want to make one final comment, which was mentioned by Michael as well, but what we learned in Chile, it was immediately applicable for us in March. In some ways, it was like a small-scale dress rehearsal for the COVID crisis when we had to bring back all of our students who were abroad in the spring, which was about 140 students in various locations. And so the things we learned about communication, about transparency, about looping in parents and making them part of the process, all of those things were really helpful when we had to deal with a crisis on a global scale rather than in just one place. All right. And so with that, I think we have some time for questions. So I'm going to invite Michael to come back. And Agustin, hello.
Yes, thank you, Nicole, and Michael for this wonderful presentation. We are really happy to see it from the other side. You know, I remember we discussed this while the events were going on at that time, but you know, it's always good to remember and reanalyze what happened a year ago in Chile. You know, we have been experiencing this from the last year, and of course with the pandemic. So it's good to see it from your side, from your perspective, you know, outside a Chilean mind. So thank you, Michael and Nicole, for this wonderful presentation. As Nicole mentioned, we have some minutes for a Q&A session, so please do not hesitate to ask Nicole and Michael the questions through the Q&A tab or the chat. Okay, for people joining now, we just finished the presentation entitled Studying Chile in Times of Uncertainty, the experience of a program director during the Chilean outbreak of 2019. By the way, everything will be posted later in our social networks and also in our YouTube channel in case you want to um, review it again or send it to your colleagues, friends around the world. So please, if you have questions, we want to read them, hear them, etc. Okay. I actually have one question here. It was sent through my WhatsApp. Um, Maybe this question will be for Michael, since Michael was on the grounds that year. Michael, someone is asking me like, what was basically the greatest challenges you faced during during that special semester? Any challenges? Of course, this was something actually new for even for us. I think I remember I told you I never experienced something like this in my life. So it took us all from zero. There was no experience besides that. So any thoughts on that, Michael? Like any the greatest challenge you face? I'm not sure if something similar happened while you were director in Spain. From your point of view, from the point of view of students, anything you can share with us?
I think this is a terrific question, Augustine, and I think there were actually two challenges that I had never faced before. One is to ensure the safety of the students in a situation of heightened danger. And we focused a lot of attention, we meaning you and the International Relations Office and UAE, and we at St. John, St. Ben's, focused a lot on making sure that the students were safe and making sure that nothing happened to them in this chaotic time. But there was a second challenge as well, and that was to use what was happening as an educational opportunity and to continue the analysis and the reflection and the education that the students really came to Chile to acquire. And I think some of the reflection sessions were psychological in that they helped the students process their feelings and their observations, but some of the sessions were actually pedagogical. We tried to use what was happening as a living laboratory to understand the culture and the history and the economics and the politics of Chile. And I think the two challenges were really safety and making sure that the experience was educational, and that in light of those two, I think we actually were very successful with both. We kept the students safe, and they felt safe and they were safe. And in talking with the students when since they've returned to the United States, I know that they've learned a great deal about Chile and about Latin America and about their own country and the importance of politics and economics and culture in shaping what's happening every day. So I think the two challenges were safety and making sure it was an educational experience.
Mm. Yeah, thanks, Michael. Related to that, actually, to the last phrase you mentioned, do you think like the learning objectives of the program were affected by the crisis? Did you notice like any changes, for example, in the contents of the courses at the time? We know that the university decided to cancel some days, especially like the hot days where we knew big protests were going to happen in both Viña del Mar or Santiago campus. But did you notice any change, for example, in the contents of the classes? Any major issues on that you were aware at least, or your students shared to you?
There were changes in content and also changes in teaching techniques as the professors at UIE and as I tried to adapt to the situation. I think that one of the consequences of the pandemic is that now all of us everywhere in the world are more flexible and more conversant in the use of technology. So there were changes and there were sacrifices that I had to make in terms of academic content, and the other professors had to make in terms of academic content as we made the shift. But we also gained something by being eyewitnesses to a historical event. So there were some losses, there were some gains, but I think going forward now we're much, much better prepared all over the world, and especially at UIE, to deal with these kinds of unpredictable and chaotic events.
Yeah, that is such a good point. I think, well, by the way, we were preparing both together. I remember with you, Michael, and also with Carlos Ramirez, the director, a presentation at NAPSA for this year related to how to deal with these chaotic events, sort of like disaster management for students. But then we have the pandemic and everything was canceled and it was not an option. So, well, learning objectives, of course, change, and but it was for a good thing, I believe. Thank you, Michael. We have some questions here from the audience. Maybe this can be for both of you, Michael and Nicole. One from the audience asked, like, can you describe the protests in Viña del Mar? How many days they last? How long they tended to last during each day? Did the American students tend to be targets of the demonstrators? That's it's a good question. Maybe, well, Michael or Nicole, you can answer. Yes.
Let me try to answer, but it's a little difficult because there were so many protests. The largest protest took place in Santiago on October 25th, and the official estimate for that protest was 1.2 million. But the news reports said that they were sure that it was an underestimate, that there were probably 1.5 million or even a bit more protesters in Santiago at the time. The protests were overwhelmingly, as I said, 99% peaceful. The Americans were not targets of the protests. These were not anti-American protests. These were protests against the policies and institutions of Chile. They were not anti-American in any way. They were not anti-anything. In fact, in some ways, I think of them as pro-democracy protests, pro-economic justice protests that were taking place against some very serious issues that Chile faces as a society and as a country. So there was no anti-Americanism. There was no, and the violence was deeply disturbing, but the majority of protests, including most of the protests in Viña del Mar, were very peaceful. One of the things that did happen is that there was a lot of vandalism that comes along with the protests, often done by a very, very small minority of people. And that was actually very similar to what happened in Minneapolis. I live in Minneapolis. I observed the protests around the brutal murder of George Floyd. The protests in Minneapolis were overwhelmingly peaceful, and then there were a small very, very small number of people who were engaged in systematic vandalism that caused horrible, horrible problems. And the same situation occurred in Chile. So the protests lasted for a long time. They lasted almost until the beginning of December. And just to give those of you who are not Chileans context, a year after the massive protest in Santiago on October 25th, Chileans voted overwhelmingly to write a new constitution. And that new constitution, the elections for the Constituent Assembly will be in April coming up, in April 2021. And April 2022, Chile will have a new and hopefully much more just constitution. So I think the protests are continuing, although my understanding, Augustine, and you can correct me, is that they're now very small and entirely peaceful. The final thing I want to say is that there's another question I see in the box that's actually related. Did the students want to join the protests, and how did I handle it? The students did want to join the protests, and I told them that they were absolutely forbidden to join the protests for two reasons. One is for their safety, but second is that it is illegal for a foreigner in Chile to engage in social protests. Only the Chileans are allowed to protest. Foreigners are not allowed to join demonstrations or to protest government policies. And the students could have been, if they had been arrested during a protest, they could have been sent home. So I did forbid all of them from joining the protests. A few of them, I learned afterwards, did anyway, and nothing happened to them, but they did want to join the protests. And I emphasized that ours is to observe and learn. Ours is not to weigh in on one side or another.
Yeah. Well, I remember during those days that we also suggested the students to stay away from the protests because of the physical potential problems that they may have. Unfortunately, during the first days, there was a lot of violence between protesters and the police forces. Some protesters, they lost their eyeballs, and well, there was a lot of potential danger for the student. So I believe, for example, in the case of Nicole, she's in the central office of the Global Education Department. Probably the same thing applied later for all your students, because I know St. John's have a terrific program abroad, and the same thing happened later. Well, what was happening in Hong Kong, for example, then inside the United States. So I believe then some new protocols were created for the safety of both students and also directors. We were in the same pace at the time. It was a good opportunity for us to create safety protocols in all the senses. After the social outbreak, of course, then the COVID pandemic, attack us. So we also needed to recreate and organize and create also new policies for this. So any other questions from the audience? I think the time is almost up. I think there's one more. Were you close to sending the students back to Minnesota at any time? Yeah, I was going to actually ask a similar question. So were you close to sending students back to Minnesota at any time? It happened for many other partners that they decided to call their students back at the universities from all around the world. The same thing happened with the COVID situation. We only had the students 1 week in March with us, and then everyone went back. But related to that question, Michael or Nicole, what was your policy, like the CSV, SAU policy at that time?
I can take that one and just say, like, were we close to calling students back? Yes, we were. And at the end of the day, I think we're glad that we didn't, but there are always a lot of factors that you need to look at. We were paying close attention to what Michael was telling us was happening, what our insurance provider was telling us was happening, what UAI was talking about. It was the closest we ever came to recalling students until March, when we recalled all of our students. But at that moment, it was a really big decision, but we decided that if students followed the safety protocols that had been set out by UAI and by Michael, that there was that it was reasonable that they could be safe. If they avoided protests, if they followed curfew, that they could be safe in Chile and they could finish their semester out. And also UAI was still going back and forth between classes happening in person, classes happening online. And so because the academics were still happening, we did decide to allow our students to stay.
May I add something here, Nicole? This was a decision that you can't make automatically. It was something that we considered every single day. What is the current situation? What do we know from UAI? What do we know from on the ground observations? What do we know from our students? So it's not a decision that you can make automatically at any time. It's really a judgment call. And every single day we looked at the situation and we made a decision. And I think that's important to realize that this isn't something that can be automatic. It has to be a carefully thought through decision. And as things change every day as they do, you have to keep thinking about it and keep deciding.
And we did offer students the opportunity to come home. So I also want to mention that if they felt very unsafe, that we did facilitate them returning to Minnesota and finishing their courses remotely.
Yes, students have the chance to decide. That's great. And just one last question, and with this, we've finished this terrific presentation, Nicole and Michael. We have one question, like, why do they think foreigners wanted to join the protesters? Maybe any clues, Michael? Why a foreigner would like to join the protest? Did you want to join, for example? Just a personal question.
I think this is a very interesting question. I joined recently the protests against the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And I can understand why someone would want to join a protest if they feel that there's a certain injustice that is happening. And some of my students felt that the majority of Chileans were protesting very legitimate social problems that the country faced, and they wanted to support them. But I think it's very important to realize, and I need to realize this as well as the students, that we need to take care of our own problems, and we need to let other people deal with their problems. And so it's not our role to necessarily protest wrongs that are happening in Chile. Our role is to protest wrongs that are happening in the United States, and we have lots of them. And so I understand the desire of a lot of our students to want to protest. In fact, many of them wanted to protest along with their host families, and they wanted to support and be with their host families and join the protest. But I kept telling them that that's not our role, that's not our right as outsiders, and that was hard for them to accept, and I understand why it's hard for them to accept.
Yes. Thank you for that answer, Michael. I think, well, I don't want to hold you both more than we discussed before. It's almost 12 o'clock. Well, it's 12 o'clock here in Chile. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Michael, for taking the time to share your thoughts, your experience. For us, as Direction of International Relations at Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez. We deeply appreciate your commitment, your partnership through all these years, and please say hello also to Kevin, the director at the office, and well, to all our colleagues and friends at College of St. Benedict St. John's. So thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Michael. Hope to see you soon. And remember, please, to participate in this international fair. Thank you both. And please stay warm. I know it's cold in Minnesota. It's going to be more cold in the next day. So stay warm.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.